Hi guys, I thought today what we'd do is we'd have a look at setting up your camera because it is quite important. Now, when you get your new camera, invariably it comes out with a whole bunch of default settings, and when you turn it on, the first thing it's going to ask you is to set up your date and your time, which is pretty easy to do, and you just follow the on-screen instructions. Now, when that's been set up, the first thing that we need to do is to decide whether we're going to shoot JPEG images or RAW images. Now, with JPEG images, what happens is that you shoot a picture and your camera applies a whole bunch of in-camera settings to it, tweaks if you like, to the camera. You can of course select what style of picture you would like, whether you want a bright image, a subtle image, a portrait image, or whatever parameter you would like the camera to apply to it, black and white for that matter. If you're shooting raw images, the camera does no post-processing at all. It shoots the picture, saves it onto the camera, and you have to apply those processing parameters to the image afterwards in a program like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop or one of the many other raw image processors out there. Now, the advantage of shooting raw is that you're going to be able to get your best image quality because you can control so much in terms of contrast, in terms of color balance and exposure and all manner of things after you've actually shot the picture. So there's a huge latitude for correction and for enhancement. If you're shooting JPEG images, what you see is pretty much what you get. The advantages of shooting JPEGs is that they're ready to go. You can send them to friends, you can print them, you can put them onto your social media platforms or whatever it is that you want to do. You're going to get better image quality out of a raw image, but it means more work. So you need to choose where you want to go on this. Do you want the high quality or do you want the convenience of JPEG? The next thing we need to set is our white balance. Now, what white balance is just whether we want a cool image, a warm image, what are the tones in the image. That on my camera is a little button at the top here where we can set the white balance. Unlike your quality, which is generally a menu item, here we can set that white balance to a whole bunch of settings, including some custom settings and direct input of color temperatures. Now, your camera will probably come out with its default setting as auto white balance, and that's all well and good because most of the time you are going to get the color balance pretty good. What it tends to do is to make your whites white and your blacks neutral, your grays neutral, that sort of thing. But sometimes we don't want it neutral. Sometimes at sunset, for example, we want warm tones to come through. At night you want blue tones, surely. You want those cool night tones to be there. Same in overcast weather. You're shooting in a forest. It's not warm, it's cool. And so what I do is switch my camera off of auto white balance onto daylight. And in your menu, when you hit that little white balance control, it'll bring up a whole lot of icons, and there's one there of a little sun, which is your daylight setting. And that gives you a neutral image when you're shooting in the middle of the day. Come sunset, however, it holds that setting, but because the lighting is so much warmer at sunset, it'll bring those warm tones into your image. And for me, that's what I want. The same applies to the cooler settings. If you're shooting in the evening, you're shooting at night, it'll bring those cool tones into the image. If you're shooting in the shade, you need to be a little bit careful because the shade is actually lit by the blue sky and not by the sun. And so it tends to have a rather cool look to it. And in that same white balance menu, you will find that there's a picture of a little house with a shadow down on the right side of it usually. And you can use that setting just to warm up these cool tones in the shade. But generally, if you keep that set to sunlight, to daylight, you're going to get a pretty nice image whether you're shooting in the middle of the day or at sunset, or at sunrise for that matter. Now the next thing we need to set up is our ISO. And what the ISO is in effect, it's an adjustment of the sensitivity of the sensor of the camera to light. Now it actually doesn't alter the sensitivity of the sensor because that's set at factory. I mean, that's how it was made. But it in effect makes the camera more sensitive to light as you push that ISO level up. Now normal these days is around 100 ISO. Most cameras you will find their default setting is at 100 ISO, and you can push it up as you start to get down in your light levels. As it starts to get darker, you can push that up to 200, to 400, 800 or 1600. Indeed, you can just keep going on some of the cameras right up to 400,000 ISO or something. Now, to get your best image quality, you're going to need to keep that ISO as low as possible. I usually keep it at about 100 ISO if we're doing scenery and travel photography and that sort of thing. If we're shooting wildlife, I'll put it to 400 so that I can just get those shutter speeds up a little bit, because we're shooting with a long lens. Your camera straight out of factory will most likely have it set to auto ISO, and you just need to be a little bit careful with that, because what can happen if you don't control it is that your camera, as the light levels fall, will push your ISO levels up and up and up and up, to the extent that your image quality deteriorates and you find yourself at 12,500 ISO with huge noise and structure and a horrible image. Sometimes it's useful, it can be useful depending on where and how you're working, and what I do is I've limited how far the camera can push the ISO. I've set that a limit of 800, and I find under those conditions I enjoy the convenience of auto ISO without it going too high and destroying the image quality. Depending on what camera you have, some of the large format sensor cameras, you could quite easily go all the way to 6,400 or thereabouts before you start to run into problems. Next, we want to look at your mode settings. Now, many cameras have creative modes, and there's sport and there's portrait and there's scenery and a whole bunch of things, and they're not as creative as the camera manufacturers would like you to believe. Watch a couple of these videos of ours and you will soon know how to set your camera up for sports and for portraiture and for scenery and all that sort of stuff. It's not very difficult, and you have so much more control available. So we're not going to go into those modes, but we will talk about manual, shutter priority and the rest of them. So let's start with manual. On my camera, a little dial on the left hand side. Quite often it is on the right hand side of the prism, but wherever it is on your camera, let's start with manual. If you're working in a studio or with flashlights and that sort of thing, it's kind of where you want to be in terms of modes. Very useful if you want to lock down your exposures. I do use it for panoramas. Sometimes if we're shooting interiors, I will lock down that exposure, but not very often. The next mode on my camera is shutter priority, and that's an S or an SV on some of the camera's shutter variants. And that can be useful, where you can dial in your shutter speed and your camera then selects the aperture, the correct aperture to use. You need to be a little bit careful, because let's say we pop in a thousandth of a second because we want quite a high shutter speed. Now the camera then, depending on what lens you've got on your camera then has a choice of somewhere between 5 and 8 stops. Now a stop is the difference between shutter speeds, two different shutter speeds, or between one aperture and the next aperture. And on this little lens that I've got here, it's an f4 lens. So if we look at the apertures that we've got available, we've got f4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16 and 22. 6 apertures. So if you set a thousandth of a second, your camera can only work within those 6 apertures. And what can happen very easily is you find yourself either underexposing or overexposing, most often underexposing, and you don't really know that you're doing it because you think that the camera is in control and doing things. Yes, quite often in the viewfinder or on the LCD screen, there's a little icon that pops up to say, hello, you're underexposing. But it's very easy to miss that in the heat of the moment. So I tend to stay away from shutter priority. Again, it's very easy to make sure that you are getting high shutter speeds if you're working in aperture priority, which is the next one we're going to be talking about, and it's a much safer place to be working than in shutter priority. So let's go to aperture priority. Aperture priority, or AV, there you control the aperture and the camera then picks the shutter speed. And that's so much safer, because if you look at the shutter speeds that you've got available to you, this camera of mine starts at 60 seconds of exposure, and so it goes from 60 seconds to 30 to 15 to 8 to 4 to 1, and then we start to go to half a second and all the way up to 8,000ths of a second. So that range of shutter speeds that you've got is way higher than the range of apertures. So if you dial in an f5.6 or an 8 or whatever it is, your camera then has the choice of a whole bunch of options, a whole bunch of shutter speeds that it can match up to that aperture to ensure that you get the correct exposure. A much safer way of working. The next one is program mode. Now, despite a lot of bad press, program is actually not a bad way to work. With program, the camera will then choose the shutter speed and the aperture based on what the metering tells it, because it uses this fancy algorithm built into the camera to look at the scene in front of it, and considering what lens is attached to the camera and the light levels, it will then choose an appropriate shutter and aperture for you for those conditions. Now that's using the technology that's built into the camera, and all you've got to do then is deal with actually creating the image and keep an eye on what the camera is doing in terms of exposure. Is it getting it right? And you can very easily see that from your exposure warnings or from the histogram, and just adjust things using the little plus minus, the little exposure compensation button to either up or lower the exposure. I find it a very easy way to work. I find it a very quick way to work, and a very safe way if you're working in a game reserve, for example, and you're driving along and the light levels are changing as the animals move in and out from the trees and that sort of stuff. Because the last thing you want to do is have your exposure locked down and suddenly you find that the light levels have changed, or the animal has now moved into shade and now you have to start adjusting light levels. That's just too slow. So when we're in a game reserve, I set my camera onto program, I set the ISO into 400, and we're ready to get to action in an instant. We see the animal, we're on it, and we're shooting pictures, as opposed to worrying about exposures and that sort of thing. If we're shooting travel photography, if we're driving around and we're shooting scenery and stuff like that, again, you can work very easily in that mode. You're out there, you're shooting pictures, your camera's controlling it, you just keeping an eye on things to make sure it's doing the right thing. And quite frankly, if you're shooting scenery and there's nothing specific or nothing technical about it, whether the camera shoots at a 2/50th of a second at f8 or a 500th of a second at 5.6, it doesn't really make any difference. Yes, there will be a marginal change in depth of field, but unless you're wanting something specific, it doesn't matter. Now, let's assume you are wanting something specific. Now, with most cameras, if the camera, for example, has picked 500th of a second at f5.6 and you want it at f8, you just change it using one of the control dials, either on the back of the camera. Sometimes there's a circular dial which you can turn. I've got these two dials up at the top here. All you do is look at the aperture and change it to what you want the aperture to be, or you look at the shutter speed in your viewfinder and change it to whatever you want the shutter speed to do. A very nice way to work, a very easy way to work, and it's something we've been using for many years. Next up is drive. My control for the drive is around the back here. Sometimes it's on a button on the back, but somewhere you're going to be able to control what they call the drive mode. And it's not really a drive mode, because that comes from the old days when we shot film. but it is whether you want to shoot single shot. In other words, every photograph you have to push the button, whether you want to shoot continuous, so you can hold the shutter button down and do 10 or 15 or 20 pictures or whatever it is you want to do, or you can put it onto self timer. I tend to put mine onto continuous because that's the way I like to work, and then I can very easily control how many photographs we're taking, whether we're going to take just one picture, a whole bunch of pictures, or just keep it down as we're nailing some action. Next up is your focus mode and your focus points. Now, and we've got a little bird here that's singing a really, really beautiful tune, but we'll work around him. So your focus points are where in the viewfinder do you want to focus? Where is your subject? And you can select that point. So you put the focus point on your subject, and the camera will use that point to focus on. Now, when the camera is focusing, it can be done in one of two ways. It can either do a single focus, so you push the shutter down to the first stop and you get the little beep, and it locks that focus in, or you press it down onto that first stop, and now the camera will focus on your subject, and as your subject moves, it'll track that focus. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Do give us a thumbs up if you have, and make sure to subscribe and hit the little reminder bell so that you get reminded of our next video. Thanks for joining us on this, and we'll see you on the next one. Cheers.